that's maybe one of the fear that is linked to this Alaska meeting, that if President Putin, President Trump agrees something that is totally against the Ukrainian will, that wouldn't be a good situation.
Now, the UK will host a meeting of security advisors from the US, Ukraine and Europe this afternoon. The summit will be hosted by Foreign Secretary David Lammy and US Vice President J.D. Vance, who is staying with the Foreign Secretary, as it happens this weekend, on a family holiday. The meeting was announced after President Zelensky spoke with Prime Minister Keir Starmer earlier this morning, and after President Trump announced yesterday that he and President Putin will be meeting in Alaska next Friday. Pekka Haavisto is a Finnish former foreign minister, and he joins us now. Pekka, good afternoon. Welcome back to the show.
Hello, good afternoon, and good to be online.
Pekka, what do you make of what you heard so far from President Trump? He mentioned that territory swaps are going to have to be part of this peace process. Does that sound like that is a peace process that is likely to succeed?
Well, this is, of course, has been quite bumpy road on different peace initiatives and peace processes, and we don't know yet what President Trump exactly has in his mind. But of course, I can see already quite reserved comment by President Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, who has commented that Ukraine cannot do or make any compromises against its constitution and law, and of course the territories of Ukraine are protected by their own constitution. So it's not an easy way, but of course, as such, it's maybe good that President Trump and President Putin are finally meeting and can talk directly. But somebody is missing from the table, and that's of course Ukraine at the moment.
What do you think the role will be of the European countries, the so-called coalition of the willing?
I think the coalition of the willing from the very beginning, even if there were high expectations, of course, towards some kind of peacekeeping force and so forth, they can appear on the ground only when there is a ceasefire or even peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. And they are not planning to be at the front, but somehow guaranteeing Ukraine's security for the future, preventing probably a new attack against Ukraine, maybe building up the Ukraine military and training and so forth. And I think the coalition of the willing will be an important component, but it cannot be used immediately before the ceasefire is there.
Do you think that there will come a point, perhaps, where Europe will have to also put pressure on President Zelensky if, as we are led to believe, the Russian government has put forward proposals, as we read in the Times today, that they get to keep certain territories, one of them, of course, being Crimea. Do you envisage a point where this coalition of the willing will have to turn around to President Zelensky and say, look, we can no longer support Ukraine as we have done so in the last few years. You're going to have to accept a deal that perhaps is not an ideal deal for Ukraine, but we have to find a solution to this war at some point, and compromises will be made. Do you think conversations like that are likely?
Well, of course, President Zelensky was, I would say, badly humiliated already this spring in Washington when he was pressured by US and US president, and luckily now the relation is better. But I think it will go in that way that the US will make its own decisions on the arms trade with Ukraine, sending or not sending military equipment to Ukraine. And that, of course, very much dominates the overall picture. If there comes a day that US is not on board supporting Ukraine, my analysis is that Europe alone cannot continue for very long and keep the Ukraine fighting, so to say. It would, of course, be the best solution that Europe and US have the same view of the situation and can support Ukraine as long as possible. But it's too early to say how this diplomatic dance now will be continuing. But of course, everybody knows that you cannot make a peace in Ukraine over the heads of the Ukrainians. And that's maybe one of the fear that is linked to this Alaska meeting, that if President Putin, President Trump agrees something that is totally against the Ukrainian will, that wouldn't be a good situation.
But we're seeing already, though, a difficulty in this agreement, which is that the Russians seem intent on holding on to at least some of the territory that they have taken since the invasion. And also, if you want to date back all the way to 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, but 20% of Ukrainian territory at the moment has got Russian forces on it. Whereas we hear from President Zelensky this morning that Ukrainians will not give their land to occupiers. That seems a bit of an impasse already, and we haven't even started.
Well, that's true that it will not be easy. First of all, regarding Crimea, if you go back to the 2022 talks in Istanbul in Turkey, the early peace talks were held there after immediately after the start of the conflict, and then there were at the table some ideas that could there be in the future, for example, a popular vote in Crimea about the future of Crimea, something like that, that there will be different solutions. And of course, in peace deals and ceasefire deals, some of these kind of solutions can be proposed. And of course, the ceasefire might be different than the final peace deal. The ceasefire might include that the troops stop where they are and stay where they are, and then final peace agreement might take longer time, and it can even take years to admit on the final agreement. But of course, most important would be to stop the killing now.
Just a final question. Do you think Vladimir Putin wants a ceasefire? Is there enough pressure for him to actually need a ceasefire? Let's not forget that those sanctions that were going to come in yesterday have failed to materialize. Some say he's using President Trump to buy himself more time. So far, he's been able to withstand the pressures from international sanctions. Does he need a ceasefire, or do you think that he is actually on a different playbook than everybody else?
Well, I can see that maybe one is playing chess and another is boxing, so it's not equal game always. But to speak about the Russia, I think President Putin knows well how to consume time in this process, and he maybe doesn't feel that his position is very weak. They have started remarkably military production, and they have been skillful with the drone technology, as the Ukrainians have been as well. So it's this conflict cannot be maybe solved at the front. This has to be solved in the diplomatic table one day, and I'm sure President Putin knows that. And the real threat might be the economic sanctions posed by US if those come true. And of course, President Putin is currently doing everything to avoid that. And I think meeting with President Trump and so forth on his own territory, by the way, in Alaska, is a step, of course, towards US some kind of positive diplomatic gesture, but partly of this is certainly playing time.
Pekka Haavisto, former Finnish foreign minister, thank you so much for giving us your time. I really appreciate it.